Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey everyone, B1B Flyer here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint the Kell Hounds using contrast paints. Let me begin by saying you don't need contrast paints to do this scheme. The reason for the demonstration is that I wanted to show the results of Templar black contrast paint, as I've already made a tutorial for the Blood Angel red. More importantly, I wanted to show how to work using two separate contrast paints next to each other, and the process to minimize mistakes and make touch-ups easier. This red and black combo can be used for a number of other schemes that utilize the combination, and I've got some of those listed in the video description below. The paints I'll be using for the main scheme are Pro Acryl Bright Warm Gray, Blood Angel Red and Black Templar contrast paints, as well as Army Painter Gunmetal and Strong Tone Wash. In addition to those, I'm going to use the following detail colors: Pro Acryl Bright Yellow Green, Army Painter Military Shader, Vallejo US Field Drab, and Stonewall Gray. As always, feel free to substitute your preferred paints and shades as you see fit. For brushes, I'll be using a 00 and number 1 Kolinsky from Monument Hobbies for fine details, and a synthetic 0 and number 2 for most of the contrast paint work. I've also got an eye makeup brush for dry brushing highlights. I've got the legendary plastic sculpt of Morgan Kell's Archer, and in addition to using the official text description of red and black for the Kell Hounds, using a couple various sources of artwork for the inspiration will be helpful. I'll be going with a combination of styles from the Morgan Kell render from Battletech Legends, as well as this Shadowhawk. You can also check out camospecs.com for more references. I've primed the miniature white with my airbrush, but a light colored spray primer of your choice will work fine because there's going to be a base coat over the top of it. You might be wondering why the need for a base coat over the primer. The main reason for this process will be to have the exact match touch-up color. It's not necessary, and if you have a color that is very close to your primer, you're welcome to just stick with that primer coat. Contrast paint is very undercoat sensitive when it comes to its results, and I've found that white tends to show more uneven surface colors. I prefer to use light grays and ivories, and here is no exception. I've used the bright warm gray to try it out, as it has a warm tone to it and I wanted to see its results. A similar light gray base coat of your choice should work just as well. Since I'm working with contrast paints, I want to minimize any touch-ups or errors due to the difficulty matching tones and drying times. Using my number 1 brush, I'm going to start by applying gunmetal to the metallic areas. I'm mainly focusing on anything that is hard to reach. Shoulder and hip sockets are tight areas, and I don't want any paint getting on adjacent areas after I've painted them with the contrast. You don't have to do every area with this step, but I would at the very least get into any recessed areas so you don't have to worry about getting paint there later on. My reference art also included a light gray on the Archer artwork, but I'm just going to use metallic on all of those areas to keep things a bit more simple. Try to keep things as neat as possible, and don't rush. Don't worry about fixing any mistakes yet, because the next step is to add a wash to the metallics to set some shadows. I'm using Army Painter's Strong Tone, which is a dark brown, and I think looks good with the red and black colors, but if you prefer a black, it will look good too. I'll just add one coat to the same areas where the metallics were applied, again trying to be as neat and careful as possible. Once this wash is applied, let it dry completely. Now I'll take that bright warm gray from my base coat and touch up any areas where I may have gotten paint where I don't want it. Take a good look around the areas where there's deep recesses, as I always seem to find an edge or two where my brush touched inadvertently. 1, maybe 2 coats will be fine for this step depending on the darkness of the paint. If you're not using contrast paints for the red or black areas, then you can skip this step. Anytime you work with contrast paints, make sure to thoroughly shake the bottle and mix all the medium inside that can settle. I always add a clipped metal sprue or glass bead to my paints to help it mix. I've switched to my number 2 synthetic brush for this. Contrast paint loves to climb up the bristles of your brush, so if you can avoid using your good brushes while working with it, it will help with their longevity. I'm working on painting one small section at a time. I don't want to be rushed because I need to keep the areas I want red and metallic free from black pigment. I'll be able to touch up after, but the more careful I am now, the less work later. I'm only going to have 1 pop of red on the legs instead of the multiples on the render art. You can do more or none, and the scheme is still correct. I'm treating this contrast paint more so like a regular paint than a coverage wash, but I'm still going to avoid putting too much on to avoid pooling in the recesses. I'd also recommend you work from the inside out as far as painting the inner areas of the miniature first, in case you're like me and you forget about the wet paint on the arm or whatever, and rest your finger when you're not paying attention. Once you've coated all the areas you want black, check to see if any paint got into any recessed metallic areas and wick it away with your brush. The metallic should still show through if you remove the majority of the contrast paint relatively quickly. Once you're done checking for pooling, look over the black painted areas very closely. Contrast paint has a tendency to pull back, and occasionally this will leave small areas looking like they didn't get any pigment. Just get a small amount of paint on your brush and touch up as needed, and don't forget to thoroughly clean your brush after you're done. You'll want to let the contrast paint dry for about an hour before touch-ups and reapplying the red. This will avoid pulling any wet paint from a recess on accident and causing more hassle. I'm also going to apply my main canopy color of bright yellow-green before the red so I can work in towards the surrounding edges when I do apply that red. I'm using a bright yellow color knowing I'll be applying a wash over it later to change it to a more green hue. If I get any on the edges around the canopy, I can again touch up easily with my base coat gray. With the first paint step dry, I've got my Blood Angel red shaken and ready to go. I'm using the same brush as before, but if you need to switch to a smaller brush for any hard to reach or narrow areas, don't be afraid to do so. Again, working in small areas at a time and being as neat as possible, and bringing the red up to the edge of the black as carefully as possible. This is why the black was applied first with contrast paint. Red will have a much easier time being lost in the transition areas, and black is much easier to fix if I get red on it. If I were to make a mistake applying black over red, I'd have a much more difficult time getting the red to match the surrounding areas. If you're using regular acrylic paints, you can apply the colors in either order. Using the same process as with the black, I'm going to check areas for pooling and wick away as needed. Then after that, inspect for areas where the paint either wasn't fully applied or looks like it may need some more pigment. I would wait until it's nearly dry to touch up the red, as it will show more if you try to fix an area and you run the risk of reactivating the still wet paint and causing uneven coverage in areas and possibly coffee stain. I'm now going to do several washes using Army Painter's Military Shader. It's a dark green color in case you don't have it. I wanted to try yet another method of jeweling a cockpit, but with minimal painting and glazing. With my 00 fine detail brush, I'm using the Army Painter wash due to it being much thicker and easier to push into a corner than a thinner version. The first layer is focusing on getting into all the outer edges to darken the lines between the yellow and the red. I'm going to put a heavy emphasis on the lower left corner and push or pull any heavy pigment away from that upper right area to keep it from getting too dark for now. After about 10 minutes of drying, I'm going to come back with the same wash, but focus on the lower left regions of each of the main cockpit windows. If I see any areas I want a bit darker around the perimeter, I'll put a light amount of wash into those areas as well, avoiding the yellow. The wash will want to stick to itself where the pigment was heavier from the first layer, and that helps with adding the shadowed corner effect. Now I'll let that dry for a few more minutes, and then come back to it to do one more shading layer. I'm almost just dotting the wash in the lower left corner to make it the darkest point of the window. Don't overthink it, and don't try to mess with it too much once it's applied. Let that dry completely, because next I'm going to add just a touch of the original yellow-green in the form of a glaze by thinning the paint with some water and adding small amounts of paint on the upper corner and edge areas. The difference is subtle and slow to bring back the intensity of the yellow, so if you take your time and go slow, you'll find a stopping point that looks good to you. Don't try to just put a dot of undiluted paint in the upper corner. It will counter the shaded gradient from the work with the wash. At this point, the miniature is effectively finished, not counting any further details to add, and if you like the appearance of the contrast paints without any exaggerated highlights, then well done. That being said, just as in most of my other contrast paint tutorials, I like to do a layer of dry brushing to really help bring out the edge accents on the model and take full benefit of the color gradients provided by the contrast paint. Using Stonewall Gray, I'm taking my makeup brush and working in a dab of paint on the paper towel. I'm working the brush in every direction to ensure there's no wet paint in the center of the brush. I'll also rotate the handle as I swipe the towel and even do a few swirls. I really want a very small amount of paint here, and in most cases I'll only load my brush once to do an entire miniature. It's a good idea to test out the amount of paint on the brush by going over an area like the base to see how it applies. You can also test it out on some black construction paper as well. Using very light brush pressure, I'm gently dragging the bristles downward and at high angles to catch the top side of the raised edges first. I would suggest starting on the black areas as the gray complements them best, and then move on to the red afterwards. This way I don't end up with too strong of a gray highlight on the red. Take your time with this as well, and if you find that there's an area with a bit too much highlight, you can take a damp cotton swab or even a quick swipe of a moistened finger to gently remove some of the gray paint. And that's the complete process for painting Kell Hounds with contrast paints. I've gone on to apply a couple decals for fighting prone graphics before adding some jeweling to the lasers and dirt effects onto the feet to match the cracked wasteland style bases. After sealing the miniature with a matte varnish, I used an acrylic gloss varnish on the canopy and the lasers. I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and I'll let Tex take it from here.
We certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and leave your questions or comments below. Follow us on Facebook at Battletech Camo Specs Online. Check out our website at camospecs.com. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Shutdown sequence, whatever.